Japanese cinema is one of the most accomplished and most varied of all national cinemas. I enjoy teaching Japanese cinema very much, and students in my classes respond positively to the large number of excellent films that come out of the Japanese cinematic tradition. My name is Christopher Lepke, and I'm a professor of Chinese cultural studies at the University of Alberta. I am not an expert on Japanese film, and I cannot claim to be an authority, but I learned some Japanese when I was in school, have traveled throughout Japan several times, and I have a strong teaching interest in Japanese cinema. What I like the most is teaching introductory courses in East Asian cinema, where I can pick some of the greatest Japanese films ever made and expose students to them, students who, for the most part, have never seen such films before. What stands out to me should be of no surprise to anyone. I would like to start with the three classic Japanese filmmakers of the mid-20th century, Mizoguchi Kenji, Ozu Yasujiro, and Kurosawa Akira. In historical films or Jidai Geki, like Sancho the Bailiff and Ugetsu, which was inspired by the imperial era fantastic tales, Mizoguchi drills down into the minutiae of ordinary human lives to show that the stories of a bygone era still have relevance in modern times. Despite the vast changes over the centuries, basic ethical principles such as compassion toward others and self-sacrifice remain true. Sancho the Bailiff is a film that everyone should see. It is a great example of the wisdom of Buddhism and the power of the Bodhisattva Kannon. We could use more devotion toward her in this world. Circumstances change, but cruelty and violence remain unchanged. How do ordinary individuals get through it? How do they survive? How do they properly act in the world? This film shows us how. On a formal level, Mizoguchi lingers over the actors in his works with a steady, patient camera lens that takes in the human and natural images of the film frame. He allows the audience to absorb these images by giving ample time to each shot before moving on. This characteristic is almost totally lost in the contemporary era, except by a small handful of auteur filmmakers such as the German Wim Wenders, the Taiwanese Hou Xiaoshen, and the Chinese Jia Zhangke. We are not used to this style, but it is a tendency that can truly satisfy the serious film aficionado and perhaps enable us to slow down a bit in life and to weigh the value of each moment. Ozu Yasujiro shares the deliberate and methodical pacing of the progression of shot sequences that we can see in the films of Mizoguchi, even though Ozu's works are entirely set in his own present day. Ozu is probably my favorite Japanese director, and I guess because I am not an expert on Japan, I don't have to defend my preferences. I have always had a deep respect for his steadfast loyalty to the unadorned reality of the present. He refuses to indulge in voiceovers or flashbacks, both of which are common in cinema. He is only interested in delivering to the audience the rawest, most unvarnished renderings of daily lives, the unremarkable lives that we all live regularly, the familiar and the taken for granted. At the same time, Ozu recognizes the ultimate failure of realism to capture the totality of existence, the inevitability that his medium must contain itself by offering on the screen a mere slice of our existences, a fraction of time that is supposed to suggest all of time, but is bursting at the edges. This time image that Ozu presents us with is not just a slice in time, it is a spatial metonymy as well. Ozu presents us with a flattened image, an accentuated two-dimensionality that homes in on the depth of domestic scenes, objects near the front of the camera that have nothing to do with the action itself, conversations between characters in a domestic environment, various elements of the home, doors and windows whose frames are caught within the arbitrary frame of the screen image itself, and ultimately random background images beyond the interiors of homes, such things as clothes drying on a clothesline, telephone wires, the walls of other houses, shrubs, and even pedestrians from the neighborhood who come strolling by. I often teach one of two Ozu films, even though there are many great ones to choose from, Late Spring or Tokyo Story. Each film taps into the traditional subject of filial piety, raising the specter in the post-war world of what Japanese and other East Asians will do as individuals, as relational beings in a new world of global capitalism, in which no one has time anymore for family relationships or a focus on their everyday lives. Gone is the pastoral world of past centuries, and in its place, we see washers and dryers, trains, buses, routinized jobs where one becomes their career, a doctor, a hairdresser, or a railroad office worker, or perhaps a clerk in a tire company. Ozu harnesses these taken for granted aspects of contemporary society to illuminate the evanescence of life and the cruel banality of the modern world. In the midst of the march forward of progress, he also illustrates compassion and self-sacrifice, such as that of the father in Late Spring, who tricks his daughter into moving on with her life, despite the fact that she professes a lifelong devotion to him. In a world where our acts are judged more by quantity than quality, it is also valuable to dwell on how carefully and completely Ozu crafts his films, so that once they are done and given to us, we can scarcely assert how anything could be added or taken away. They are perfect the way they are, like a Mozart concerto. It is hard to imagine that in the historical context in which Mitsuguchi and Ozu lived and worked, that there was room for another great Japanese filmmaker. But if all one knew about Japanese film was the name Kurosawa Akira, then that certainly would be enough. There are a couple of things that set Kurosawa apart from his peers, not necessarily better, but definitely different. One is his use of flashback. We can see how he uses this technique in films like the iconic Rashomon to bring the narration of a character in a current scene together with the visual images of past events and to build narrative into his film. Although he twists the technique in this film to show that the belief in our own recollections is deeply flawed, that we really do not remember how things were, even though we can vividly reproduce those memories in the present. In Rashomon, this technique is dramatically on display in the murder trial of a ruffian who must face the testimonies of several witnesses, including the summoned spirit of the deceased victim. You know you're doomed when the person whom you murdered comes back to testify against you on the witness stand. An example of this technique that has made a deep impression on me is the one employed in Kurosawa's sleeper classic, Redbeard. This is one of his less eventful films, the story of a country doctor who wishes he could do exciting things with his time on earth, things he considers more important than dedicating his life to simple folk in a village setting. In the course of listening to the stories of the unremarkable medical patients in the country medical clinic, both the arrogant young city doctor Yasumoto and we, the audience, are drawn into their stories, into their lives, and are made to rethink the whole issue of what is important in life. Kurosawa employs the combined voiceover flashback technique to resuscitate in visual form the repressed memories of the characters and in the process demonstrate to Dr. Yasumoto the value of caring for them. Kurosawa completely upends the presumed value structure and material hierarchy that heretofore informed his life priorities. The most astounding feature in Japanese film, I would say, is not that these giants of the industry arose out of the tumult of mid-century Japan, as remarkable as that is. More remarkable is the generations after them that have continued to build upon the Japanese cinema tradition and have continued to astound audiences with each passing epoch. I will conclude by briefly mentioning three of these. Coming on the heels of the three greats was the enormously imaginative filmmaker Imamura Shohei. Imamura was uncomfortable working in the manicured aesthetic confines that attention to understatement and painstaking craftsmanship required. In the 1997 classic The Eel, for example, Imamura allows imagination to run wild, fueling the narrative in the film with cascading levels of bizarre subplot and storyline, and leaving us wondering what was actually real and what was not. Imamura's unwieldy aesthetics is the antithesis of a director like Ozu Yasujiro, but nevertheless satisfying and impressive. We have to say that the films of Itami Juzo are equally wild and unwieldy in a creative and poignant way. Although his most famous is the social satire Tampopo, my favorite is the highly personal film The Funeral, a seemingly autobiographical depiction of the death and funeral of a film worker's father. The film is not entirely situated emotionally in a melancholy way, as elements of humor and social satire shine through it. Finally, no filmmaker better epitomizes the despondency of the 1990s in Japan than does Kitano Takashi in such richly psychological portraits as the crime drama Kunstler cinema Hanabi. Takashi interweaves brilliant colors and sumptuous music, as well as a primarily visually driven narrative with the personal tragedies of two police detectives and the violent revenge motif to create an objective correlative for the lost decade. It is a tour de force. Everyone should watch Japanese films. Please don't think that many people do not watch Japanese films, because they do. Although what I have said are just a few words of a non-expert, the implication is that Japan has proudly produced one of the great national cinemas over the past 90 years. But national cinema is insufficient to characterize this body of work. The truth is that Japanese cinema draws amply on the cultural traditions of others, such as the classic stories of pre-modern China, as well as British and American novels, and even the plays of Shakespeare. In turn, Japanese cinema has had an enormous impact on world cinema of all sorts. Its strength is in its diversity and its continual regeneration of creative energy. Thank you.
Hello, my name is William Carroll, and I'm a professor of modern and contemporary Japanese cultural studies at the University of Alberta. In general, my focus is on cinema, and in this webinar I'm going to be talking about J-horror. When I say that I will be discussing J-horror, I should clarify that I'm not talking about the history of the horror genre in Japan broadly, but rather to a narrow and specific group of films beginning in the late 1980s through the present, made for the most part by a small, closely knit group of filmmakers, which have given rise to a number of films, themes, and aesthetic tendencies that have become internationally recognized under the banner of J-horror. The exact boundary between the broader horror genre in Japanese cinema and this more narrow subset of films that I will be talking about today can be quite fluid, but talking about these films more narrowly will help us identify where their aesthetics come from and what is unique about it. Just to give a bit of background about the film industry and horror genre as a whole in Japan, the horror genre in Japanese cinema arguably dates back earlier than we can trace, given the number of lost films there are from the first decades of Japan's film history. There are known to have been adaptations of classic ghost stories such as The Peony Lantern or Yotsuya Kaidan as early as the 1910s, both of which have also been adapted many times since then. From around the 1920s through the 1960s, the Japanese film industry had a strong centralized studio system that dominated film production, distribution, and exhibition throughout the country. Film studios owned production studios and backlots, where it was possible to build an entire fictional city or setting and film an entire movie there. There are some internationally well-known Japanese films based on ghost stories from this period, such as Mizoguchi Kenji's Ugetsu Monogatari or Kobayashi Masaki's Kwaidan, but these are not really indicative of the horror genre as it was thought of at the time, which was typically a lower budget and less prestigious genre associated with smaller studios, such as the Ghost Cat films of Shinko Studio in the 1930s starring Suzuki Sumiko, or the horror films directed by Nakagawa Nobuo at Shin Toho in the 1950s. Even though these films were made at smaller studios, filmmakers working at these smaller studios did still have studios and backlots at their disposal, and they could use set design and studio-controlled lighting to create an otherworldly atmosphere for their films, even if it meant having to reuse elements of sets from film to film. However, by the late 1960s, the movie industry had weakened substantially, largely because of the rise of television and other forms of recreation and entertainment. People started going to movie theaters less often, and as a result of that, the studios started losing money. Some of them were bought out by larger companies, some of them went bankrupt, and some of them transitioned into television and pornographic film production. By the 1970s, the horror genre continued to exist in two primary circuits: theatrically released exploitation films on the one hand, and television series such as Unbalanced Horror Theater or Sunday Horror Series on the other. The 1970s is also when home video was initially developed. And by the 1980s, video rental stores had become a major industry in Japan. As home video grew, another production industry called V-cinema, which is to say direct-to-video, became a lucrative business, and this is another place where the horror genre proliferated. These were horror movies made for shoestring budgets that never played in movie theaters or even on television, but they went straight to movie rental stores. Working on even more substantially limited budgets than the horror filmmakers of Japan's studio era, and without studio sets and backlots at their disposal, V-cinema filmmakers needed to come up with new ways to distinguish their work and to frighten or disgust their audiences. One of the ways that V-cinema horror filmmakers tried to distinguish their work was by making the films extraordinarily violent. These horror filmmakers didn't have to worry about censorship or a rating system. As a result, there are a number of Japanese horror movies from the early to mid-1980s that are notorious for their realistic-looking graphic violence, in particular the Guinea Pig series. There was also the opposite trend, a group of filmmakers who attempted to create horror while showing hardly any violence at all, almost entirely through atmospherics. But because they didn't have access to studio sets, they had to film everything on location, in real houses, in real buildings, and on real street corners. But still they had to try to create a frightening atmosphere in these real, mundane locations. Initially, the more violent trend was more popular because it was easier for filmmakers to distinguish themselves that way, but in 1989 there was an event that changed that. A man named Miyazaki Tsutomu was arrested for kidnapping and murdering 4 young girls, and it was claimed in various media reports that he was an avid collector of very violent horror movies. In reaction to this, many video stores throughout the country announced that they would no longer carry violent horror movies. Subsequently, the more atmospheric tendency within V-cinema horror became the more dominant one, at least for the time being. Eventually, there was a resurgence of the more grotesque and violent type of horror in Japanese cinema, most famously with Miike Takashi's Audition from 1999. But what I'm calling J-horror here for today's purposes is the horror aesthetic that grows out of the less directly violent and more atmospheric tendency. So when I say J-horror, I am referring to a specific set of films that 1. Are horror films from Japan, late 1980s to the present. 2. Are filmed on location, in real buildings, houses, streets, etc., and in fairly mundane settings. 3. Grow out of the atmospheric rather than violent aesthetics of V-cinema horror. And 4. Were at least initially made by a tightly knit group of filmmakers who regularly collaborated with one another in a variety of ways. Out of the first generation of filmmakers of J-horror, the three most prolific writers of secondary literature about the horror genre are Konaka Chiaki, Takahashi Hiroshi, and Kurosawa Kiyoshi. Of these three, Konaka Chiaki is the one whose work in the horror genre is least known internationally, but he was screenwriter of numerous formative works of J-horror in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Takahashi Hiroshi began his career as a film critic, but broke through as a screenwriter in the mid-1990s for the film Joyure, also known as Don't Look Up, directed by Nakata Hideo. Today he is best known internationally as the screenwriter of the film Ringu, also directed by Nakata Hideo. Ringu is perhaps still the best known J-horror film, and certainly the one that has spawned the most direct remakes internationally, and shaped many people's idea of what J-horror aesthetics are. Kurosawa Kiyoshi is also perhaps the most prolific J-horror filmmaker, and while none of his films are quite as widely known as Ringu or Ju-on: The Grudge, his contributions to J-horror, particularly Cure and Pulse, are widely considered some of the best films of the cycle. There are other important J-horror filmmakers who haven't written as extensively on the history and aesthetics of horror, but many of these other filmmakers are also closely connected to these three. Nakata Hideo, director of Ringu, worked extensively with Takahashi Hiroshi as a writer-director team in the 1990s. Furthermore, both Nakata Hideo and Kurosawa Kiyoshi studied film history in college under the same teacher, Hasumi Shigehiko, one of the most influential film critics and theorists in Japan since the 1970s, and both of them still maintain a close relationship with him. Kurosawa Kiyoshi and Takahashi Hiroshi have also taught film production courses at Tokyo University of the Arts since the 1990s. One of the students that they taught was none other than Shimizu Takashi, the director of the Ju-on series, who initially conceived the idea in an assignment for one of their classes. Numerous other contemporary horror filmmakers in Japan also studied film production under them. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Konaka was a screenwriter for low-budget direct-to-video horror movies, and Takahashi Hiroshi, who was then still a critic, came across Konaka's films accidentally, and began praising Konaka's work in the pages of the journal Cahiers du Cinéma Japon, where he coined the phrase Konaka Theory to describe the original formal approach that he saw Konaka using in these low-budget horror films. Konaka himself later wrote out the set of self-imposed guidelines that he had used for these projects in his essay Konaka Ridon to wa Nanika. In parallel to this dialogue between Takahashi and Konaka, Kurosawa began writing on the history of the horror genre in film and culture journals in the mid-1980s, and he directed his first theatrically released horror film, Sweet Home, in 1989. He first laid out a theory of what defines horror as a genre in his essay Hora Eiga to wa Nanika in 1993, in which he likewise singled out Konaka's work and began writing in dialogue with Takahashi and Konaka on a possible future aesthetics for Japanese horror films. I have paraphrased here the major points that Konaka discusses in his essay, What is Konaka Theory?, which he develops in more detail than I am able to provide here. He stresses that he did not conceive of these as a broad theory of horror films, but rather as practical techniques for creating fear in the context of low-budget direct-to-video horror movies that he was working in while making scary true stories. Some of his guidelines are not followed at all by other J-horror directors, but a number of these do form the basis of J-horror aesthetics as they have come to be known, and I have highlighted the major ones here. In particular, Konaka argued that providing explanations for supernatural phenomena should be avoided at all costs. Even relatively simple explanations, such as claiming that a haunted house was built on an ancient graveyard, or explaining the history or motivations of a ghost. This is a consistent strategy used by J-horror filmmakers. There are some subsequent J-horror films that do provide some backstory to their ghosts, but these are typically based on popular horror literature or manga, and in all of these cases the filmmakers curtail significantly the amount of explanation that is given for the ghosts in these films by comparison to their source material. Another point that Konaka stresses, the use of ominous icons, examples of which he cites include mysterious black handprints left on a wall, long strands of hair found in unexpected places, or pictures of enshrouded figures scribbled by young children, abound in J-horror films. Interestingly, Konaka also cautions against using either point-of-view shots or over-the-shoulder shots from the perspective of ghosts and monsters, claiming that the so-called killer point-of-view shot that was so common in Italian giallo and American slashers had become a cliché. Furthermore, he stated that his own purpose in making horror films was to simulate for the audience a living person's experience of encountering a ghost, and thus he preferred to align the perspective of these scenes as much as possible with the perspective of the person who is encountering the ghost in the scene. For him, this meant primarily showing shots of the ghost or monster roughly from the living character's perspective, as well as facial shots of the character's reaction to the ghost. Lastly, I will discuss the two most important prescriptions for our purposes today, which are both about the treatment of ghosts. One is the emphasis on ghosts as the most frightening thing to encounter in a horror movie. The reason for this is that ghosts are incorporeal, they're difficult to distinguish definitively from living people, and they cannot be killed, unlike a vampire or a zombie. This is a key point that Konaka, Takahashi, and Kurosawa all agree on. Kurosawa describes the encounter of a ghost and why it is so frightening in his 1993 essay, What is Horror Cinema? Writing, "An enshrouded figure is standing on the other side of the fence. If you look closely, it's a friend of yours who has died. Initially you're startled, then the figure disappears. How can you overcome this fear? There is no way to escape from it, at least as long as you are alive. Your life has completely changed. Even if the calamity goes away, or never even happens, the shadow of the dead will stay with you, even if you flee to the end of the universe." Kurosawa places particular emphasis on the need to look closely at the image. It's enshrouded, so it's difficult to make out the identity of the face, and further, the only way to identify this figure as a ghost is to recognize it as someone you know who has died. The only visual distinction between ghosts and humans are subtle ones, such as enshrouding, which could conceivably have other plausible explanations. This description Kurosawa gives here could be used to describe many encounters with ghosts in his own subsequent horror films, and it speaks to the key reason that ghosts are the preferred monster in J-horror, which is that they cannot be definitively distinguished from the living in photography and on film. With that in mind, I will return to the one highlighted point I haven't addressed yet in Konaka Theory, which is his method for depicting ghosts as unclear and blurry. Konaka notes that in the past, many horror films made in Japan and elsewhere had developed techniques to identify ghosts to audience members, often to make the figures translucent or to light them with very strange, unnatural light colors that had no obvious diegetic source. Konaka criticizes these techniques because he claims they are simply shorthand ways to demarcate figures as ghosts, and they do nothing to recreate the sensation of encountering a ghost to the audience. To create this sensation of encountering a ghost for his audience, Konaka instead turned to spirit photographs as a model. While working on the Scary True Story series in the early 1990s, Konaka examined famous examples of spirit photographs from history to develop an improved method for depicting ghosts. He found that in general, many of the figures in these looked quite ordinary, apart from one crucial off-putting detail that many viewers might not be able to articulate. In particular, Konaka found that many of the supposed ghosts in spirit photographs were figures that were unclear because of either focus or shadow, in spite of the fact that these figures should have been illuminated and clear based on other cues in the photograph. He recounts creating a ghost-like figure for The Gymnasium in Summer, an episode of the Scary True Horror series that he made in 1991, which he says was the first time he consciously imitated spirit photography to make a ghost in one of his films. This image is a point-of-view shot from a high school girl looking onto the stage of an auditorium and seeing a blurry figure. Konaka explains that he and director Tsuruta Norio created this image by filming the stage illuminated with no one sitting on top of it and in focus. They then turned off the lights illuminating the stage and placed the performer on top of it, lighting only the figure at the center of the stage, and shifted the focus so that the figure was out of focus even though it was illuminated. In post-production, they composited these two images together. The resulting image is impossible, given the fact that the stage is in focus. This figure sitting on it could not be so out of focus as it is here. Even though most viewers of these films may not know enough about photography to know why this looks wrong, they instinctively will see this and recognize that there is something unnatural about the image, drawing them to scrutinize the blurred, centrally framed figure ever more closely without giving them an answer why it looks wrong. There is nothing to indicate to audiences that this figure is definitely a ghost, and it would be possible to conceive of other explanations for it. But for Konaka, this is a more effective way of recreating the sense of uncertainty that a person would experience while encountering an incomprehensible figure like a ghost. The precise techniques that Konaka and Tsuruta used to create this image were not necessarily the ones used by other J-horror filmmakers, but their depictions of ghosts share this in common. They often use photographic editing and lighting and staging tricks to make possible ghost figures subtly off-putting, without definitively identifying figures as ghosts in order to create this sense of uncertainty when characters encounter them, and this further compels viewers to examine the images more closely to discern what exactly is wrong with the image. Consider this image from the 1996 film Joyure, written by Takahashi Hiroshi and directed by Nakata Hideo. This is a point-of-view shot from a character waving at the young woman who is framed at the bottom right here. For the most part, the image seems innocuous enough, but if you look very closely behind this young woman's hand, you can see the faintest image of the face and hair of a woman in white behind the bus window. She is faint enough that many viewers will likely not even notice her, and there is also nothing about her appearance that definitively identifies her as a supernatural being. In the context of the scene, however, there are multiple shots from this exact perspective, but only one in which this faint figure appears in the background, suggesting that she is a ghostly presence because it is difficult to imagine how she could have gotten there naturally, and because of the unnatural faintness of the figure, but without directly depicting her doing anything unnatural or impossible. In that way, the image suggests that she might be a ghost, but refuses to confirm it. Consider also this image from Kurosawa Kiyoshi's 2001 film, Pulse. This, again, is from a character's point of view shot, looking towards the doorway where he had entered a room. The room looks largely the same as when he had entered it several shots previously, apart from one subtle, scarcely illuminated detail. A dark dress in silhouette in the darkest corner of the room, mostly only noticeable because of a small section of this figure's legs. In this case, the figure is so dark from the lighting of the room, it's quite difficult to determine anything about this figure, but it nevertheless produces a similarly unsettling feeling because of the indecipherability of the figure, and the fact that intuitively this seems like an unnatural place for an ordinary person to be standing, especially since even these faint visual hints of her presence were not there in an earlier shot from this perspective. And of course, we should include here the first, brief appearance of the most famous J-horror ghost, Sadako in Ringu, seen only fleetingly in the reflection of a television set after the character in the foreground has watched the videotape that unleashes her curse. Sadako's face is not visible at all, and it's unclear from this image whether that's simply because the reflection gets darker in that area, whether the long black hair we see on her white dress is obstructing it, or whether it's because she's a figure not of this world. In each of these cases, ghosts are introduced in the films through techniques that make the figures blurry, indistinct, or enshrouded in ways that compel viewers to examine the film frame more closely to try to discern what they are. In some cases, it requires a great deal of attention to the film frame even to notice these figures in the first place. Further, each of them uses filmmaking techniques, often ones derived from spirit photography, to make the figures seem unnatural in ways that are not easy for ordinary viewers to articulate why they look unnatural. Many J-horror films also depict diegetically placed visual media themselves as points of contact between characters in the realm of the living with those in the realm of the dead. The most famous example is the cursed videotape in Ringu, which shows a series of 7 seemingly unrelated shots that cause its viewers to die a week after viewing it. The embedded video shows elements that are observed by characters in the film to be impossible for a variety of reasons, and the common analog video distortions in the form of snow and video lines getting out of alignment suggest 2 possible alternate explanations. One, that the video is very old to the point that its illusory powers are breaking down naturally, and 2, that there is some supernatural phenomenon taking place in front of the camera that the technology is incapable of capturing, which is what's causing the technical breakdown. Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Pulse similarly features digital videos circulating on the internet that doom viewers to certain death upon viewing them. These likewise exhibit visual distortion, albeit of a different variety, pointing to the material of digital rather than analog video, and to the video's circulation on the internet. Even in J-horror films where cursed media is not central to the narrative, films will frequently include some form of embedded visual media, if only for a brief scene, exhibiting visual distortion as evidence of a supernatural phenomenon that is disrupting the process of visual representation in these media that ordinary viewers take for granted. Further, many of these sequences show characters performing the kind of close observation practice of peripheral details and the material structure of the images that they compel their viewers to perform as well. The close attention to the material structure of different types of mediated images, analog video, digital video, still photographs, and of course the medium of film itself, likely derives from the fact that these filmmakers have themselves worked so extensively in different types of media, from their early work in V-cinema and television to their later theatrically released films, and as they oversaw the transition in theatrically released cinema from traditional 35mm film to digital cinema. It also comes likely from the fact that the majority of the main J-horror filmmakers had studied film history and film theory extensively as university students. They're able to use their knowledge of the structure and different types of mediated images to produce images that are subtly at odds with the typical standards of representation, but in ways that many viewers will not be able to identify precisely or articulate why they look unnatural, which is what produces their uncanny effect. Thank you for watching and listening to my webinar. I do have a few recommendations for further reading if you're interested in learning more about Japanese horror. There are, of course, many books on the subject of Japanese horror in cinema, but these are the ones that I've found the most useful, both in teaching and in preparing my webinar for today. I highly recommend Michael Crandall's book, Ghost in the Well, which was published only 2 years ago or so, which primarily focuses on the history of the horror genre in Japan's studio era, which I briefly made reference to near the beginning of the webinar. If you're interested in reading more about earlier Japanese horror cinema, this book is by far the most complete and useful source in English on that subject. Regarding the subject of more contemporary J-horror, the English language book that I've found the most useful is an anthology called Horror to the Extreme, Changing Boundaries in Asian Cinema, edited by Jinhee Choi and Mitsuyo Wada Marciano. The book covers not only Japanese but also South Korean and Hong Kong horror cinema since the 1990s. Mitsuyo Wada Marciano's chapter covers the transition from V-cinema to theatrical cinema in J-horror, and goes into more detail about some of the holdovers in film form and narrative construction of the films that results from that. Chika Kinoshita's chapter on Kurosawa Kiyoshi's film Loft also addresses many of the connections between the J-horror filmmakers, and she is the first person to identify J-horror as a movement rather than as a genre, which is what has formed the basis of how I've approached J-horror in this webinar. There's also a very useful chapter in here on the branding of Asia Extreme, which addresses the more violent side of contemporary Japanese horror cinema that I did not talk as much about today. Filmmakers like Miike Takashi and his many imitators, but also connections that distributors in the UK and North America have tried to draw between contemporary Japanese, South Korean, and other Asian horror cinema, and how filmmakers and producers in Asia have responded to those tendencies. Finally, if you're able to read Japanese, I would recommend looking at books written by the filmmakers whose writings I've referenced today. Many of Takahashi Hiroshi's writings have been collected in an anthology called Eiga no Ma, and Konaka Chiaki's writings have been collected in Hora Eiga no Midyoku. Kurosawa Kiyoshi has published many books, more than I can list here, but for the subject of horror specifically, I would recommend his Kurosawa Kiyoshi no Kyofu no Eiga Shi, which is a long discussion between him and an independent filmmaker named Shinozaki Makoto. This is where he talks about his personal history with the horror genre and how it influenced his own work. One particularly interesting thing he discusses here is the way that the majority of horror films he enjoyed growing up were ones made on elaborate Gothic studio sets, and how he has had to grapple in his own films with the fact that he has not been able to make those kinds of sets because of the changing nature of the way that films have been made. I would also recommend Kurosawa's Eiga wa Osoroshi, which includes the essay Hora Eiga to wa Nanika that I talked about here today. And finally, he has two books called Eiga no Kowai Hanashi and Eiga no Motto Kowai Hanashi, which are discussions between him and others working with horror. Not only filmmakers like Takahashi Hiroshi and Konaka Chiaki, but also other artists who work with horror in other media, such as the manga artist Ito Junji.